Part 2 of the story of Joseph Smith and Emma's last son, David Hiram Smith. Next on Polygamy, What Love Is This? I recently obtained a book entitled From Mission to Madness, The Last Son of the Mormon Prophet, and it was written by Valine Tippett Avery. It chronicles the story of David Hiram Smith, who was the last son of Joseph and Emma. Now, David was born in November of 1844, which was 5 months after Joseph Smith was killed.
Yeah.
And in part 1, this is part 2, in part 1 we covered the backstory mostly, and we left off at the end of part 1 where the Mormons under Brigham Young had left Utah, and Emma with her family stayed in Nauvoo with her younger children. Right. I think 3 or 4 of them. Yeah. She refused to admit, Emma always refused to admit that her husband was a polygamist, and she refused the advances of Mormon polygamists, and we talked about that last time too, who wanted her to become one of his pearl wives after her husband was dead, and she refused to accept the leadership of Brigham Young over the church that her husband had established. Now, Earl Erskine is here again with us from the LDS Church, and you know, these things are something that I didn't learn in the polygamy group, and I don't think you learned a lot of this in the Mormon church.
No, I didn't know much of it. I knew, my sense was that she was not happy with Brigham Young. That was about all I kind of knew, that they didn't agree with each other, and when he left for Utah, then she just stayed back.
But you didn't really know why, the truth of why.
No, and I didn't know anything about Joseph Smith's polygamy at all at that point.
Yeah, neither did I either.
Yeah. I thought it was all after he died that people were sealed to him, so yeah.
Well, it brings out some interesting
it does.
tidbits, you know, that we probably a lot of people didn't know about. The last time, also in part 1, we talked about the blessings that Joseph Smith had given his 2 sons, the eldest son, Joseph Smith III, and the youngest, David Hiram Smith, before he was ever born. Now, both blessings included Joseph Smith's prophecy that the boys would be great leaders over his church. His prophecy totally failed, obviously, especially the one concerning David Hiram Smith. Now, Joseph Smith III struggled with his decision to head the RLDS, which is the Missouri, the original church that didn't come west with the other Mormons. He had tried making a living, Joseph Smith III had tried making a living by farming. He tried to be admitted to the bar, the legal bar, to become a lawyer, and he failed that, and he failed running a store. And so he began wondering how running a poor church would ever be financially successful. We quote from page 47.
Kind of worked for Dad, I guess. Joseph was too bright to believe that leading a poor church was the road to riches. He pondered the offer for over 2 years, and by late 1859, he made his decision in the affirmative. He wrote to William Marks, "I am soon going to take my father's place at the head of the Mormon Church." Joseph's language was unambiguous. The real Mormon Church did not reside in Utah.
and that, that went on for years, which one was the true Mormon Church. Yeah. Now, the younger son, David, was artistic by nature, and he also produced some artistic writings. In some of them, he made it very plain that the faithful should keep marriage covenants. He believed that 2 makes a marriage, not more, and that monogamy was the biblical law. And he pointed to Noah's family, that each one of them, Noah and his sons, each one took only one wife on the ark. Now, he reasoned that David and Solomon had disobeyed the monogamy principle, and that the restoration reaffirmed that the faithful should have only one wife. Now, still, at this point, he did not believe that his father had been a polygamist.
And I'm sure that's what his mom told him, too.
Exactly. And we cover how he found out and what happened when he found out in this segment. Now, during the year of 1866, and totally unknown to Emma, Joseph III was making motions to renew the family's association with the Utah Mormons. He wanted to bring them all back together. And Emma feared that in doing this, he would result in renewed bitterness and strife in their lives again, and would eventually affect David. So reaching out to the Utah Mormons initially had very little success. But in 1869, Joseph III decided to try again, and he called his brothers, Alexander and David, to go on a missionary journey with him to Utah and then to California. They would always be on the defense regarding their father and his polygamy.
And we read from the book, page 88, prone to hot-headedness, defensiveness, when his father's reputation was attacked, Alex minced no words in argument. Unlike Alex, David reacted with diplomacy and tact to the opposition he met, especially on religious issues. Both men, however, shared a firm commitment to their faith. The differences between them were of style, not conviction.
Now, this is the faith of the RLDS,
Right,
not the Utah Mormons.
Right.
Now, Brigham Young was successful in settling the Mormons in the West, and they were building farms and industry and building up the Mormon church. And Brigham Young had revered Joseph Smith Jr. and made sure that the Mormon members also revered him and his legacy. And they continued in their belief in the Book of Mormon and in obedience to the commandment of polygamy, the Utah Mormons. It was unthinkable to Brigham Young that Joseph Smith's sons would not see that this was their father's church, and he believed that they would join them at some point. So the RLDS thought the Utah Mormons would join them, and the Utah Mormons thought that they would join them, and so
wishful thinking.
That's where they're at. Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, who was also killed during the gunfight in the jail, had a son, John Smith, and he was a patriarch in the Utah Mormon Church. He greeted the two brothers upon their arrival in Salt Lake City, and we read this about David's cousin, John Smith, from page 95.
His liberal ways, his insistence that the rule against tobacco use was not absolute, created a distance between him and the faithful, among them his half-brother Joseph F. Smith. John was a reluctant polygamist. He made his home with his first wife, Helen, and saw so little of his second, Melissa, that he was scolded by Utah church authorities for not living the principle. When he hosted Alexander, David, or Joseph III, his second wife was so invisible that his Josephite cousins could delude themselves into thinking they were not touched by polygamy.
So you can see how deceitful they're still hiding behind the polygamy doctrine. Now, David and Alexander's agenda already expected to change the agenda of the Mormon vision, and they needed a public forum in which they could preach and debate with the Utah Mormons. And so they made an arrangement with Brigham Young to meet with Brigham Young to ask for permission to be able to use the church's tabernacle. And when they got to the meeting, it turned out that Brigham Young had invited about 20 men to the meeting, and they didn't know they were coming. And they were church leaders like John Taylor and George Q. Cannon and others. And this, of course, would be intimidating to the Smith brothers, we quote.
This was an important meeting for Brigham Young as well. Brigham Young understood that many Mormons had rejected his leadership without rejecting Mormonism. David and Alexander presented him with a quandary. If certain of the prophet's words were fulfilled, David would lead the Mormons and the Smith family would become ascendant. Therefore, when Brigham Young summoned as many of the old-time Nauvoo Mormons as he could in a short time, he most likely had four purposes in mind. He wanted them to testify to David and Alexander that their father had instituted polygamy by his own teaching and example. He wanted to set the tone of opposition to Joseph's boys in Utah so that the church leadership would remain of one mind and resistant to the nostalgic impulse to give in to the boys. He wanted to neutralize Smith family members who might be inclined to waver, and he wanted to stigmatize their mother as the source of their misguided opposition.
More proof that Brigham and Emma were not fast friends.
Fast friends.
And of course, it is no secret that Brigham Young and Emma Smith were at extreme odds with each other She later said to her son Joseph that, quote, "There is not the least particle of friendship existing between Brigham and herself," end quote. Now, Brigham Young had called Emma a liar. In fact, he called her the damnedest liar that ever lived. And he accused her of stealing the family's portraits and Joseph Smith's ring, despite the fact that she had a right to possess them.
Yeah.
So I guess he wanted them
Strange.
to put them on display at the Mormon church. I don't know. But some of the Utah Mormons suspected that David intended to break the power and the influence of Brigham Young and in that way abolish polygamy. Now, the Utah Mormons are really into polygamy at this point.
Yeah.
So obviously there was tension at this meeting.
Yeah,
20 men that they hadn't expected to see, and each of them, one side denying Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and the family side defending Joseph Smith and his polygamy.
And they were probably all polygamists too themselves.
All 20 of those men, I would suspect they were. Yeah.
Jedediah Grant, and a few of the boys.
A few of those boys, yeah. In the long run, Emma's silence, if you think about it, Emma's silence and her denials about Joseph Smith's polygamy really did no favors to anyone, because that's what the Smith brothers were relying upon, denying Joseph Smith's polygamy.
Yeah.
We quote.
By her son's admission, she had told them nothing about plural marriage in her own home in Nauvoo. Joseph III, Alexander, and David drew the erroneous conclusion that their father had never participated in polygamy because it seemed to them so distasteful. Nowhere did Alexander state which remarks Young wanted him to retract, but without question they concerned plural marriage and Brigham Young's succession to Mormon leadership, the two most divisive issues in the church.
And that was the two main differences between the Missouri church, and that was
who was the
lead
in polygamy. Yeah.
And by the time the meeting was over, decisions were made and a vote was taken to deny that Joseph Smith's brothers could use the tabernacle for their preaching agenda. They were, however, granted the use of the Independence Hall by some Gentile. He'd heard what had gone on, and I think it was from the Walker family. And there the Smith brothers were able to preach to thousands of people through several nights and weeks that they were there. Lots of people came and listened to them preach from the Independence Hall. Of course, many Mormons were concerned about what would come of this.
Yeah.
Quote from 103.
The Utah Mormons had good reason to be concerned, for David and Alexander stubbornly insisted that plural marriage was not a tenet of their father's faith, and thus not a valid theological principle. Their opposition to polygamy greatly concerned the Utah leaders.
And they probably were getting a little...
Yeah. Didn't want anybody to
fall
think
apart.
about it.
Right. Now, Joseph F. Smith, by the way, he later became a president of the Mormon Church in Utah. He began a deep historical research to gather all the information he could to present to the boys that their father was not only a polygamist, but that he taught it. He taught others the principle of plural marriage. He also contacted several men and women who knew about their polygamy in Nauvoo, and this would be ex-plural wives of Joseph Smith. He solicited their personal accounts and testimonies verifying that plural marriage ceremonies were performed between Joseph Smith and some of his wives. He also got many personal accounts from women testifying they had been married to Joseph Smith and even shared the marriage bed with him. Now, some of the difficulty the Utah Mormons faced trying to prove that Joseph Smith was his close friends, Joseph Smith and his close friends were polygamists, were that, and like we said earlier, were that they all had their own denials. Not only that it was hidden, and Emma denied it. The polygamists themselves were denying it.
Well, and it was even part of what Doctrine and Covenants 101.
Right.
About not practicing polygamy.
Right, because 132 wasn't put in the Doctrine and Covenants at this time yet, right? Yeah. And so the brothers, they fell back on all of these denials. Well, see, there was no polygamy. You guys are just made it. And even today, there's groups of people who believe that polygamy came from Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith.
Wow.
And another tough hurdle to overcome was that the polygamy revelation had not been published and made public until 1843, many years after Smith actually was living polygamy. And so all of this was coming against their pro-polygamy stance. Now, we have another quote from 105.
David and Alexander used these public denials of polygamy very effectively, but even as they spoke with such confidence, they could not know the extent to which denials of plural marriage in Nauvoo had been couched in code words that actually affirmed its place in the church.
And that's another thing that came against it, because they didn't know code words were being used, like the principle or plural marriage or celestial marriage, and all of that were code words rather than polygamy.
Everlasting covenant.
Everlasting covenant, right. So in his defense of polygamy, Joseph F. Smith proved that his own father, Hiram Smith, was a liar by denying their practice of polygamy. It's interesting to note at this point that if this controversy had not taken place,
I know, this is so...
if the sons of the dead prophet Joseph Smith had not made missionary journeys to the Utah Mormons, they would not have obtained the information, the history, the affidavits from Joseph Smith's widows. And today we would not have all the information that we've got proving that he indeed was a polygamist. He taught it, he preached it, he commanded others to live it, both men and women. Were polygamous in the early Mormon church. And even today, there are, like I said, pockets of believers who don't want to believe Joseph Smith was the one who started polygamy.
I'm sure they had no idea this was going to be the result of their missionary effort here.
Yeah. We have another quote.
According to Mormon scribe Joseph F., proved that the prophet Joseph and his father had never denied celestial marriage, but had always preached against perversion of the true principle. Indirectly, he also proved that plurality of wives was a Bible doctrine and sanctioned by God. David and Alexander's attack on plural marriage provoked the defensive position and diligent research of Joseph F. Smith. It provided the church with affidavits and testimonies it would otherwise not have had, and it identified Joseph Smith's name with plural marriage more securely than before their arrival. Each side became more entrenched and less likely to give the other a hearing.
Imagine that. Could have some pretty heated discussions. It's a fly on the wall there.
Yeah.
When the Smith brothers left Utah, they went on to California, which had been their plan, and they spent a lot of time there preaching and gaining converts to the RLDS. In 1870, while they were still in California, David became quite ill. In fact, his illness was later seen by the family as an omen for his future mental decline. Years later, Alexander's daughter said that the stress of the Utah visit had been too much for David, and it broke his health. The brothers returned to Plano, Illinois, where he published a pamphlet entitled The Bible versus Polygamy. Now, I like that.
Yeah.
That he did some research in the Bible, and I really have to give him credit for doing that. It's too bad the Mormons today and the Mormon polygamists, both then and now, didn't and don't do their own Bible research as deeply as David did, Joseph Smith's son.
Yeah.
We quote,
In it, David denied that plural marriages descended from the Old Testament prophets. David's challenge to polygamous unions revealed a thorough study of the Bible and represented a genuine attempt to reason through the examples given. When he dealt with the example of the biblical King David, he addressed his contemporary polygamous friends, "Now ye sticklers for Abraham's and King David's examples, do the works of these men that were worthy of imitation. Put away the bondswoman, the many wives, and concubines."
Good advice. Good advice he came up with there. And contrary to Mormonism both then and now, Joseph Smith's youngest son, David, discovered through his New Testament study that marriage has nothing to do with the acceptance into the kingdom of God. Yeah. Again, we'll have to give him credit for embracing the truth of what the Bible was saying about this. Yeah. And he said, quote, "As for getting above angels by marrying," which is what Joseph Smith taught, "the idea is imbecile and ridiculous."
Yeah, good for him.
Good for him. He scoffed at their idea that marriage was essential for eternal life and that plural marriage was necessary for celestial glory, which is what the Mormons taught. Then they still teach it.
Yeah.
The polygamous groups still teach it anyway.
Sure.
David himself got married on May 15th of 1870 to a woman named Clara Hartshorn, but he remained plagued by poor physical health, and as time went by, mental disturbances began creeping in, and it showed up in his writings. He was still doing his artistic writings, but he continued to hold his father in high esteem as almost the perfect human being. He corresponded with his mother when he was away on mission work, and we want to quote from one of his letters to her.
Dear Mother, do not remember me as fretful, as tearful and despondent. Mother, lay all this to the feebleness of frame, and overabundant depth of thought and susceptibility of feeling, that under less motherly care would have gone home long ago to live with Jesus.
Interesting statement,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Without her, huh?
Yeah. Now, the spellings, by the way, they're not the way we spell those words today, but they're from the original letter. Now, quite abruptly in 1871, David decided to go back to Utah. And he stirred up a lot of people with his preachings and lecturing on the subject of successorship to the prophetic office. This, of course, was a challenge to Brigham Young and whoever his successor might be. But he continued with his missionary travels, and at one point it was in Manti, Iowa. I didn't even know there was a town called that in Iowa, where he discovered that some polygamists were living in that town, and it really concerned him. He wrote to his mother that they were living in shame and disgrace. But stumbling onto these polygamists was very disturbing to David, which would show that polygamy indeed was part of the early Mormon church.
Because
here was a pocket of it there.
West, or in the East.
There. So there's so much detailed information in this book. You actually have to, we can't do it justice by this short review, but you can get it, go to the library. I got mine at Amazon.com. If you're interested in this, you can do that and read it for yourself. Now, despite his times of depression and ill health, David continued his missionary journeys, including California and Utah and Idaho and the Midwest. We read from page 185.
David had grasped the difficulty with which Mormons left their church and found other religious moorings. His association with the Mass of Lyman substantiated his observations. Lyman's protest against the confines of the church took many forms, the most extreme of which was the embrace of spiritualism. Lyman believed communication with the dead could take place through seances and spiritual rappings. Joseph would not have been happy to learn that David consorted with spiritualists, especially since he had toyed with it himself in 1855. Joseph wrote to a friend that he did not know how to distinguish good from evil spirits.
Whoa. Now, this is Joseph III that they're talking about here, Joseph Smith's oldest son.
Right.
Joseph III doubted that it was wise to be involved with spiritualism, saying that he could not understand why a good spirit would stoop to tell an indirect or a direct falsehoods. He said good spirits won't lie. Good, huh?
Yeah.
That's a very great comment. Now, I did not know until I was reading this book, that Amasa Lyman was into this kind of stuff. Because he was a pretty loyal, faithful
one of the
Mormon.
12, or was he? Or, I don't know.
I don't think he was one of the 12. He might have been at one point, but he was very good friend of Joseph Smith, you know. So, but anyway, he evidently left the mainline church under Brigham Young and got into all of this stuff. Now, David and Amasa Lyman struck up a friendship, and David became deeply involved with the Amasa Lyman seances and other liberal ideas. David remained in Utah, and he was stirring up interest, meeting both friends and enemies regarding their different religious ideas. As time passed, he became philosophical about religion, about creation and nature and other topics. He had been forced to widen his viewpoint through all of this traveling and speaking with so many different people. We quote
from the book, page 207, David had taken a giant step toward doubt. That his thoughts shook the foundations of his life is illustrated by a line he had written 3 months earlier in the letter acknowledging his father's participation in plural marriage, finally. After asserting, quote, "The Bible is my guide and Christ my pattern, there is no religion for me except the gospel we believe," end quote, David added, "I know all men and all religions so well that no bridge catches me if Christ fails.
I find his comments so interesting regarding his trust in the Bible, what the Bible was teaching.
Right.
But he seemed to go off the deep end in other ways. A few months later, David knew that something was wrong with him. And sometime between the first part of December 1872 and early February 1873, tragedy struck. The press reported he had brain fever, which would have been the word for in those days.
Yeah.
David had suffered a nervous breakdown. He would never be the same again. He would seem to get stronger and returning to good health at times, but then his mind was very muddled. He even started writing letter to his brother Joseph in the form of revelation, which is kind of scary.
Yeah.
Later in 1873, David returned home to Plano, which ended up not being a particularly pleasant event. As we read this quote, remember that the last letter we quoted from Emma was very sweet and concerning. This is a little different.
To mother.
Yeah.
When David returned to his mother, she approached to embrace him. David put out his hand, fended her off, and said with uncharacteristic abruptness, "Mother, why have you deceived us?"
He knew that Joseph was a polygamist, and Emma had deceived them into maintaining he wasn't. Prior to that time, he worshipped his mother and his dead father. He seemed finally to face the truth, but he did not have the mental stability to properly unpack all of its implications. Shortly before his 32nd birthday, David ended up in the Northern Illinois Hospital and Asylum for the Insane, and that's where he stayed until he died August of 1904.
Wow. Late in the summer, on August 29, 1904, at 2:30 in the afternoon, David Hiram Smith died at the Northern Illinois Hospital and Asylum for the Insane in Elgin. The diagnosis of the immediate cause of death was diabetes mellitus, with chronic mania a contributing cause. Bright's disease, kidney failure, combined with high blood pressure, appeared to be a factor as well.
And that was just 3 months before his 60th birthday.
Wow.
He spent the rest of his life in that asylum. Polygamy has ruined so many thousands of lives through the years, including Joseph Smith's youngest son, when he discovered his father really was a polygamist. He'd been lied to and deceived. And it even destroyed Joseph Smith's own child. My question is, when will it stop?
When will it stop?
When will it ever stop?
Because it keeps going, doesn't it?
It keeps going, keeps ruining lives.
Yeah.
So that's a brief study of that book, From Mission to Madness. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And I suggest, if you're interested, to take a read of this. You know, when you meet God at his throne of judgment, who is going to be on your side? Joseph Smith or the Bible? We know there is a Mormon belief that no one can enter into the kingdom of heaven without the permission of Joseph Smith. But actually, no one can enter into the kingdom of heaven unless you're born again. That's what Jesus said. The born again experience is being made alive spiritually in Jesus Christ. There are no passages in the Bible or even ancient biblical traditions that Joseph Smith must give his okay for our entrance into heaven. It's God's heaven. He gets to say who goes there, and he gets to say how they get there. And he has revealed it in the Bible, and the Bible never says Joseph Smith or polygamy opens heaven's gates to anyone. It's all and only about Jesus. Thank you for watching.